Hello folks, welcome to this chapter introduction video. In this video we'll be covering chapter 8, civil liberties. Now civil liberties forms one part of the duo of civil liberties and civil rights. And with civil liberties we're always thinking about the individual. Civil liberties are pretty far reaching. We think often about those things that we get to do in our country, things like the freedom of speech. But fundamentally, as you'll see today, civil liberties is all about what the government can't do. We have the picture of the jailbird here, the parrot behind the cage, and the reason for that is pretty simple. Think all the way back to the colonists, those founding fathers. One of their fundamental gripes with the British government was that it was an unlimited government. People would end up in jail without really a good reason. And you think about civil liberties, we think about what the government cannot do. Things like putting us in jail without the opportunity to defend ourselves, to get a trial, to make sure that evidence is being obtained fairly, etc., etc. The list goes on. Now, you're probably already thinking about the Bill of Rights, and yes, that's a large part of it, but there's even more to it than that. So I'm going to try to give you some things to focus on as you work through the chapter on civil liberties. First, 3 key concepts. These things are going to come up again and again, and so it's good to be looking for them throughout the entire chapter. The first is just the simple idea that civil liberties are not just things that we get to do, they're limits on the government. They're constitutional limits on the government's power, and as we already mentioned, these are really listed in the Bill of Rights. That being said, these limits on the government, it's not just that you get the freedom of speech, it's that the government is limited in its ability to limit your freedom of speech. It's really actions and restrictions on the government. That being said, our second idea, you'll notice there still are limits on individuals because there are circumstances when the government can infringe on an individual's rights. There are exceptions. There's always a balance, times when your rights and liberties can be infringed by the government. And you want to be looking for those exceptions and those circumstances throughout the chapter. And lastly, there's the idea of selective incorporation. You see, so far I've been using this term government, and it's a sort of vague term because, of course, we know from our unit on federalism that there are many levels of government in our country. And there is a rather large debate, not so much anymore, but for the first 100 to 200 years of our country's history, about what exactly the Bill of Rights means when we're thinking about the state governments. And so you'll want to look throughout the chapter for evidence of why the Bill of Rights did not originally limit the states and why it does today. That has changed gradually over time. So you want to find all the different moments, and your textbook has a lot of resources on understanding this rather complex topic and helping you break it down. As far as 2 similar concepts that you want to make sure you compare and contrast, 2 concepts that really trip students up is when we talk about the freedom of religion. See, right in the First Amendment, there is the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And these are very different clauses, even though they both deal with the freedom of religion. You want to make sure you understand the differences between these 2, not just that they're both about the freedom of religion, but what specifically they do and don't apply to. They are tricky ones, so you want to be reading carefully. And lastly, the chapter mantra. This time the chapter mantra is a quote. It's from one of our former Supreme Court justices, Robert Jackson, who was a justice about the mid-20th century. In ruling on a particularly difficult freedom of speech case, actually he dissented with the majority, he said this quote, "The Constitution is not a suicide pact." What does that mean? Well, this is a really complex quote, and it's led to many complex arguments. What he's getting at is this, is yes, our rights are important, our freedoms are important, but what if the protection of those rights and freedoms leads to the downfall of our country? Isn't the Constitution formed in order to preserve the Union? And what if by protecting some of those rights, by limiting the government, we actually make the Union worse? What if we actually destroy the country in the effort to give people's rights? Well, Justice Jackson believed that there was a very delicate balancing act between liberty and order. How do we limit the government so that the people have freedoms, but not limit it too much so that we reach anarchy? Because if we have anarchy, yes, people have perfect freedom, but that's not desirable, is it? On the other hand, this is complex because if it means that the Constitution, if our freedoms can always be overridden in the name of order, in the name of preserving the Union, well, that's worrisome as well because it makes us wonder just how real our freedoms actually are. So what are you looking for? You're looking for ways to understand what the limits really are on the government's power. You're going to want to be able to describe when those limits do not apply. That is, when can the government actually limit your liberties? What are those circumstances? What are those exceptions? And with all of that, you're going to want to connect this to the idea of selective incorporation, right? How does this change when we're talking about state governments, and how has that changed over time? For our two, we're going to compare and contrast the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. What is different between those two terms? And lastly, in the back of your mind, always keep this mantra there. The Constitution is not a suicide pact. Where do you see evidence of curtailing our liberties in the name of order? Where do you see places where maybe people have too much freedom and it's damaging to the country? Where do you see places where maybe people don't have enough freedoms? We could afford a little bit more liberty. And have that in the back of your mind as you go through this chapter. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you have an excellent rest of your day.